Hi there. Thanks so much for joining me today for the latest episode of Impact Real Estate Investing. My guest today is Donald Shoup. Dr. Shoup is a distinguished research professor with a focus on economics in the Department of Urban Planning at UCLA. He began studying parking as a key link between transportation and land use, with important consequences for cities, the economy, and the environment. His book, The High Cost of Free Parking, turned an otherwise academic topic into a significant policy issue. A second book, Parking in the City, showed that parking reforms can improve urban metro areas both economically and environmentally. Be sure to go to evepicker.com to find out more about Donald Shoup on the show notes page for this episode. And be sure to sign up for my newsletter so you can access information about impact real estate investing and get the latest news about the exciting projects on my crowdfunding platform, Small Change. Hello, Donald. I'm really delighted that you've been able to join me today.
Well, thanks for inviting me to Dallas.
Yes. You've spent your career deeply immersed in parking and land economic issues, both of which are really hot button subjects right now. So I'm wondering, first of all, how did you get interested in the economics of parking and why?
Well, like everybody in parking, I think I backed him. Nobody wants to grow up to be in the parking business. And it was, I was doing my PhD dissertation in economics, and I was working on land economics. So I came to it from that angle, looking at development and the value of land. And later on, I noticed that the parking is the single biggest user of land in American cities, the curb parking and the off-street parking. But it had almost no interest from any academic or even a lot of, there were professionals in the parking industry, but they weren't looking at it from the view of land economics. So I had the field to myself for a long time. Universities always strongly advocate equality and equity, but they're very rigidly hierarchical in their own operations. That everybody has different titles like chancellor and the vice chancellor and the deans and the full professors and the associate and assistant professors and lecturers and even the students. They're seniors and juniors and sophomores and freshmen. So I think it's not just that we're hierarchical, but the things we study are also hierarchical, like international affairs are very important and national affairs are too, but state affairs are a big step down and local affairs are parochial. And then I think the lowest status topic in even local government would be parking. So I was a bottom feeder for about 30 years. But there was a lot of food at the bottom.
Yes.
And that's how I got into parking. It was so easy to discover new things because not many people had been paying attention. But now there's almost a feeding frenzy that a lot of people are beginning to study, at least among academics, or to study parking and its effects. I think that's probably what you're interested in, not parking itself, but how it affects the real estate of the city and the economy.
Yes, and housing, right? So you said it takes up a lot of land in American cities. How much land does parking take up on average?
Well, nobody knows. It's highly regulated, but no city except San Francisco has any census of parking. That you couldn't go to your city council or city planning department and say how much parking is there in Dallas. They don't know. Although they regulate it very heavily on every site, there's no aggregate number that applies to all cities. But people who have looked at it in various ways think that, maybe about 30% of the land is used for parking.
Which is a lot of land. One of the statistics I read was that New York City, which has really high housing costs, actually is the 8th most affordable city out of 20 because the land is used really economically and there's less parking. The two do certainly go hand in hand, don't they?
Well, New York is a very special case, but most cities are like it. The Department of Urban Planning has estimated there are about 3 million on-street parking spaces in New York, and nobody knows how many off-street parking spaces. But of those 3 million
That's a lot.
On-street spaces, only 3% have parking meters. So 97% of all the current parking in Manhattan, in all of New York City, is free to the driver. So of course there's terrific competition for it, and it's a nightmare trying to find a parking space in Manhattan because it's free and lots of other people want it. So there's an incredible amount of cruising around, hunting for parking. Seinfeld often talked about it. I think one time in an episode, George is coming to Jerry's apartment, and Elaine is in the passenger seat, and they can't find a parking space. And she said, "Well, let's park underground at the building." And he said, "No, I never pay for parking. Paying for parking is like going to a prostitute. Why should I pay if, when I apply myself, maybe I can get it for free?" So I think that we've all been trying to get it for free for as long as we've had cars. And everybody wants to park free, including you and me. But we have twisted our cities totally out of shape, and real estate development totally out of shape, with parking requirements that ensure that every new development has to have plenty of parking so that it won't overcrowd the free curb parking. So I think that I've seen studies. I think, yes, the Department of Commerce did one study saying that what is the biggest impediment to real estate development? Is it property taxes? Is it zoning? Is it labor unions? And almost everybody said it was required parking.
Yeah. And have you seen a shift at all over time in the last decade or two, the attitude towards parking?
Oh, I think so. I've recommended 3 basic things. One is to charge the right price for curb parking, which is the lowest price that cities can charge and still have 1 or 2 open spaces vacant. So nobody can say there's a shortage of parking, because everywhere they go, they'll see 1 or 2 open spaces. But like real estate that's valuable, it won't be free. And then to make this politically popular, because drivers don't want to pay, is that the cities dedicate the meter revenue to pay for added public services on the metered streets. Fix the sidewalks, plant street trees, clean the sidewalks, I shouldn't say police patrol right now, but extra security. And some cities give free Wi-Fi to everybody on a block that has market-priced curb parking, so that people can see the benefits of charging for parking instead of having the money disappear into the general fund. So that's one policy, is to charge the right price. Then the second is to spend the revenue and added public services. And then the third one is to remove off-street parking requirements. And you've seen all 3 of these happening in various cities. Houston just recently increased the share of the city that has no parking requirements. Houston is famous for having no zoning, but it has very elaborate parking requirements, just like any other city, except for downtown. And they recently increased the area of Houston that doesn't have any parking requirements. And some cities have removed parking requirements entirely. San Francisco removed all its off-street parking requirements, and Buffalo did, and Hartford, and London, and Mexico City. And it's spreading. That I think that I and other people have preached the gospel that parking requirements do a lot of damage, that they raise the price of housing, they increase traffic congestion, they increase air pollution. They even contribute to global warming. And I've never heard anybody planner say, no, minimum parking requirements do not have these effects. The opponents of parking requirements are proving with study after study saying how it reduces the available land for development because so much of the space has to go for required parking. And it does increase housing prices and the prices of everything because the cost of parking is hidden in the prices of everything else.
Right.
Parking requirements make parking better, but they make everything else worse. And as I said, I've never heard any urban planner say, no, parking requirements do not have these bad effects. I don't even find any professional in the planning industry or development industry who would say, no, parking requirements do not have these effects. So I think some cities have begun to remove their off-street parking requirements. Others have begun charging what I call the right price for parking, a demand-based price, based on the demand for this scarce land. And they're spending it on spending the revenue in the meter district. So I think all these three things are happening. So I think the future of parking is here. It's just not evenly spread.
Right. So, COVID-19, the pandemic has probably accelerated a bit of this thinking. I've been watching news about cities like Milan in Italy grabbing street back for pedestrians before they're fully occupied by cars again. And I'm wondering if you believe any of that will sort of help accelerate a move towards less parking, more purposeful use of valuable land.
I'm sure it will. COVID-19 has opened our eyes to a lot of things. One of them is in transportation. And people are seeing cities with very few cars, but a lot of pedestrians and a lot of cyclists and people eating in outdoor restaurants in the curb lanes. And they can see that this is a lot better looking than having all the carbs completely jammed with cars and other cars hunting to find a space that's being vacated. So I think that it will lead to big reforms, and it already is. That many cities have suspended the requirement that the required parking lots have to be used for parking, and say you can use them for restaurants. Outdoor restaurants with widely separated tables. But now Dallas and every other city, they would say, if you want to have more outdoor seating, you have to have extra parking for it. Most cities don't allow parking to be converted into outdoor restaurants. Everybody wants to eat outdoors, but you can't allow the required parking spaces to be used for restaurants because that's against the parking requirement. So I think that cities are experimenting. I don't know if Dallas has done it, but a lot of cities have allowed restaurants to expand into their parking lots for outdoor dining. It'll show people that there are better uses for land than storing empty cars.
Yes.
And even if they're used for storing empty cars, they're still vacant most of the time.
They're vacant.
If it's an office building, the parking spaces are empty during the evening, schools, and the average car is parked 95% of the time, but so there have to be an awful lot of parking spaces wherever you go, because how can you drive somewhere where there isn't plenty of parking? But we've thought of parking as free parking, and even in downtowns like in Dallas, a lot of the people who drive to work get free parking because it's paid for by the employer. Do you get free parking where you work?
I don't park. I live downtown and my office is 2 floors below where I live. So my commute is very short and I rarely drive. So.
But in your apartment, are there a parking space or 2 available to you?
Well, I have a tiny little building that has 2 spaces for the entire building. It's a building I built, so it's a bit unusual. It's probably not a fair comparison.
How did you build it without a lot of parking?
Because it's downtown, and in downtown Pittsburgh, there's no parking requirement for residential.
Oh, you're in Pittsburgh?
Yes, I am in Pittsburgh.
Oh, I thought you were in Dallas.
No, I'm in Pittsburgh. So downtown Pittsburgh for quite a while has had a zero parking requirement for downtown residential.
Yes,
Not
yes,
that the market didn't demand parking, right? That was
yes.
when the downtown market started here for residential. It was very hard to get going because people wanted to park their cars downtown. But I think in the last 10 years, that's really shifted. But I can't say that's extended to other neighborhoods. Somehow people feel entitled to have a car in a parking space.
Pittsburgh does a lot of things right. The director of your parking service is very famous in the industry, David Autorato. And I think they have some very good ideas. Say around Carnegie Mellon University, the university is the one who pioneered the policy of charging demand-based prices for curb parking.
Right.
They monitor the occupancy rate and they recommend the price that should be charged. So the best spaces have higher prices than the distant spaces. I don't know if it was in Pittsburgh, whether it was just an idea or whether it happened, but in some cities, say a grocery store will have meters by the spaces near the front door.
Interesting. That's interesting.
You pay for at a meter. The rest of the lot is free, and the meter money goes to pay to charity. So when you put your money into the meter, you know that it isn't going to Kroger, but it's going to a local charity, and they say what it's going to. So I think that's another way to slowly bring prices into managing parking.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You see a lot of strip malls where, you have a sea of parking out the front, or even in small main streets where there are parking requirements that really kind of force architecture that's overwhelmed by vehicles. And I worked at the planning department for a while, and I know what it takes to change a code, a zoning code with the requirements. It's a mammoth and expensive exercise. And so we have many smaller boroughs all over the country that have pretty old zoning codes now that require parking. And I really wonder how they're going to shift into sort of this new thinking.
Well, it's very difficult to reform zoning for parking piecemeal. That often on individual developments, the developer will ask for a variance, saying that I don't need so much parking as you require, and they would get a consultant to show that this is true. There's so much study goes into saying, well, what would, if we reduce the parking requirement, well, what should the new parking requirement be? Because it's all pulled out of thin air. There's no science at all. Planning students learn nothing about parking in their graduate studies because the professors have nothing to teach them. But they do learn that whenever they have a development project in their studios, the thing they have to worry about most is the parking requirement. So I recommend that cities should just remove off-street parking requirements. Say in Buffalo, they had pages like Pittsburgh, pages of parking requirements, and it was replaced by one sentence in the zoning code saying there's no parking required for any use. That was so much easier than saying, well, let's have a study and say, should they be cut by 20% or 30%, or maybe the parking requirement for a nail salon is too high or something like that. That it's better to just say that there are no parking requirements except for handicapped spaces, and especially what they should look like, the landscaping of them and the water runoff. Right. And the location, the quality of the parking is what planners regulate, not the quantity. But in the US, we have a huge quantity of very low quality urban designed parking.
Why do you think there's so much resistance to that? I think it's a brilliant idea because a real estate developer who has financial risk in building a building is going to think very hard about how much parking they need to market their building.
Of course, and they know how much a parking space costs.
Yeah.
That, an underground parking space can easily cost $50,000. And when they talk about the need for parking, they're not talking about how much, whether people are willing to pay that much. I think now to get into today's particular issue about Black Lives Matter, one of the things that through the years, I pointed out the fact that parking requirements strongly discriminate against low-income people. That now we have measures of the net wealth of the population, that all your assets minus all your liabilities. And of course, many young people have a negative net worth because they have student debts and no assets,
Right.
that maybe a car and a cell phone. When I looked at the median net wealth of Black families is about $17,000. Where for white families, about $160,000, I think now. But cities are requiring for apartments for low-income people and for Black people 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit. And the parking spaces could easily cost more than $17,000 each. And then there has to be parking at all the restaurants and all the theaters and all the grocery stores and every place else. So planners are willy-nilly requiring wildly expensive parking spaces that low-income people cannot afford.
Yeah.
Can you think that 1 parking space is worth more than the median net wealth of the Black population in this country? And yet cities are saying, oh, well, you need 10 spaces per 1,000 square feet for a fast food restaurant. They have no knowledge of how much parking spaces cost or what it does to the looks of the building or who can eat there and things like that. So I think that everybody probably looks at systemic racism through their own lens, but I think in planning for parking, there is a bias against low-income people in general, and because Blacks are lower income, it's a bias against Black.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. So I've been working with an architect in Australia who has been developing workforce housing for service workers like school teachers and firemen and policemen. I mean, the cost of housing is so high there, they've been driven further and further away, which means there is a bigger and bigger requirement for them to own a vehicle, right? Which is expensive. So they actually built a building with 30 units, and every person who was going to buy a unit signed a petition because this building was right next to a train station and a bikeway right into downtown. And every person signed the petition saying they weren't going to have a car, they were going to give up their car, and all they wanted was a bicycle. So and the town and town council there agreed that they could just build a small bike garage, which saved them a lot of money because they didn't have to build those 20,000 or 30,000.
As you point out, that if we have parking requirements everywhere, that it'd be hard for low-income people to get an apartment close to where they're going to work, because the whole city is spread apart because to make room for the parking.
That's right.
And I think that if a low-income person has to buy a car to get a job, which is mostly the case, then they have to support the car. They have to pay insurance for repairs and everything else. So I think we have systematically favored the car through parking requirements.
Yes.
And it's something that more cities are beginning to look at, and maybe I hope some of your listeners will take heart and say, well, yes, it's a house of cards, these parking requirements. When you ask a planner, say, well, how was this parking requirement set? They can never tell you. They can tell you what it is. When you go to the planning desk and say, I want to build a open up a new nail salon, they'll tell you how many parking spaces you have to have, but they have no idea where that number came from.
Interesting.
Or how it was derived. How would you set the parking requirement for a nail salon? And you probably know much more about real estate than most urban planners do.
Yeah, it's really tough. And so now with this pandemic, we kind of got to take another look at mass transit as well. How are people going to get around when they're worried about catching a virus?
Well, exactly. I think so. I think that, it's a slightly different policy that I'm recommending, but it's related to it, that at least in LA, and I suppose in Pittsburgh, that we were amazed at how little traffic there is during COVID when people are staying at home.
Yeah.
You could drive anywhere in Los Angeles.
Yes, here too.
You never would have gone there before, because you know that the traffic congestion was so terrible. say we have a city of Long Beach, which is south of Los Angeles and adjacent to it, has express buses to UCLA. It's about a 30-mile trip. And the schedule before COVID, it was it took about, I think, 90 minutes or something like that, at an average of 15 miles an hour on the freeway. And now during COVID, it was a 27-minute trip. And so how are you going to maintain that? And one of the things I recommend is what we already have. It's called hot lanes. Do you have these?
Yeah. We actually have a dedicated busway, which is fantastic.
That's what we need more of.
Yeah, no, I can get from downtown to the airport faster on the bus for $2.50 than I can possibly drive. And it drops you right out the front door, and it's really pretty fabulous.
Well, we have these high occupancy vehicle toll lanes where it's HOV lanes, but solo drivers can buy into it if they pay a toll. But there's an incredible amount of fraud on them because we have to have a transponder to use the lane. If you say that you're 3 people in your car, you don't pay any toll. I've seen the estimates that 30% of all the solo drivers in the toll lanes say that they're a 3-person carpool, so they pay nothing. And that bogs down the HOV lanes because they don't perform the way they should. So what LA is just about to try is to say we're going to change it to everybody pays on the toll lanes except vehicles that have 5 or more passengers. So if you're a 2-person carpool or a 3-person carpool or a 4-person carpool, you still have to pay. Of course, you get a discount on a per rider basis. You know, if there's 4 people in the car, each person only pays 25% of the toll. It'll be very easy to police the requirement that there be 5 people in the car. It's very hard for the authorities to, with cameras, to look and see, to check whether you actually have 2 or 3 people in the car. So, but if it's HOV 5, as they're calling it, I think our freeways will begin to work really well, and the buses will be able to go at high speed. If you could have an express bus from Long Beach to UCLA, and it might take half an hour instead of an hour and a half now.
Isn't that great?
So it's more land economics. The streets are very valuable land, and we're giving it away free.
Yes.
Anytime something's very valuable and you're giving it away free, there'll be a lot of competition for it. That's why there's this terrible congestion, and that leads to air pollution and fuel waste and global warming. I think I've been invited to Pittsburgh, well, maybe only once.
We'll have to invite you again.
I really enjoyed it. It's a wonderful town, of course. And I think a lot of people are moving there from New York. I remember one time there was an interviewer from New York, and I had a nice event with him. And then later I wanted to get in touch with him. And it turned out he had moved to Pittsburgh because it was so expensive in New York, and he thought he got a much better lifestyle for the price in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, it's a nice city. It's small, but there's one of everything. But listen, I have another question for you, because if I were an economist, I'd be figuring this out, and you probably already have. So with all that extra toll money and meter money, what would you do with it? And what could you do with it? How much extra money? I mean, how could that make other people's lives better, or people who walk or bike, or?
I mean, how could removing parking requirements?
No, just increasing the cost of those valuable spaces in the freeways, like charging more in tolls and charging more at meters. And
well, I think the key to it is to tell people that if we install, you don't have to install meters because you can pay for parking now with your cell phones. And some people, some new cars have that app right in the dashboard of the car. And it will be much more common in the future that your car knows what is the price of parking. If it's a new one, it knows from the web how much parking costs, and off street and on street, and it guides you to a good parking space. And so I think it'll be cashless for paying for parking in the future, frictionless. And when you find a parking space, you just touch a button on your dashboard, you're paying for parking because the car knows where it is and what the price of parking is. And then when you leave, it automatically stops paying for parking. It'd be more like making it a long distance telephone call in the old days when you just paid for how long you talked, where you called. So it'll be like charging just the market price at the lowest price that the city could charge to have one or two open spaces. When they do that, if they spend the money in the metered area, the people will understand the meters are really helping. Because say in a business district, there's many people from outside the district who are paying for parking. It's not a tax on the merchants. It's like putting a cash register out at the curb, and the neighborhood gets the revenue. I think there was one place in Pittsburgh they were thinking of running the meters in the evening, and people said no, and the city offered to run an express bus to downtown for free with the revenue, and that persuaded people, well, maybe we should run the meters in the evening if it gives us a free shuttle bus to where we want to go. I think that people ought to think of parking like on the street and off street like real estate. And you ought to allocate it. That why do we have expensive housing and free parking? We've got our priorities the wrong way around. We've just been doing the wrong thing for 100 years. And I think that it's catching up with us now. And we have different issues. We have global warming to worry about. And clearly, requiring ample free parking everywhere is not going to slow global warming. And I think that when you remove off-street parking requirements, it means there'll be a lot of land available for development.
Yes.
The new urbanists recommend liner buildings. I don't know if you've seen them in Pittsburgh, but it would be it's an important issue here in California, where there'll be an office building in the center of a giant parking lot, or a mall in the center of a giant parking lot. And if you built housing or even offices around the perimeter, converted some of the required parking into housing, the land is already assembled. There's no assembly problem. There's no remediation needed, and you wouldn't have to build underground parking. So I think that some of these giant parking lots, when there's liner buildings built around the parking lot, as you walk down the sidewalk, it'll look like a real city. Yes. It's only about 25 feet deep. But behind it is what's left of the parking lot. But people will have to start paying for parking, both on street and off street, for this to work. But I think there is a lot of land right where we want to have it ready for development, especially for work adjacent housing. I think if you want housing job balance, having building housing right on the parking lot of an office building is a great way to get it.
And so what's next for you? What are you working on? More parking or something different?
Well, a couple of things. There's a thing I think I sent you. It was a new kind of zoning for land assembly. There's a problem in the older areas. Well, Pittsburgh is a good example, but LA has a lot of old development where there are a lot of very small parcels. They were small businesses or small houses, and now they're near a rail transit stop. And it's very hard to assemble that land to build high density housing because of the holdout problem. Everybody thinks that I'm going to be the key parcel, that if I'll hold out for a high price to get my share of the gain when they build a 10-story building on this land. But if everybody thinks that way, everybody holds out, and it's very hard to assemble land. Well, there was a new idea that was pioneered here in Southern California, that there was an area that had in Simi Valley that had very narrow lots, but very deep, because it had been an equestrian subdivision from the 1920s. So each lot was about an acre or two, but they were fairly narrow along the street.
Interesting.
And the city wanted to redevelop it, but it was very hard to assemble the land because it had been various families since the 1920s. And I think it was the mayor who thought of it. He said, well, let's say if you have more than 5 acres, we'll double the allowed density. And everybody began to think, well, you mean if I'm part of a land assembly, the zoning will go up? And if I hold out, it won't? And so people began talking to each other saying that, should we participate in a land assembly? And then people began to fear that being left out, that if some of the neighbors agree, they were beginning to agree to sell their land, some of which was vacant. There were no housing on it, some of which was vacant. If they sell their land and I can't be part of a new 5-acre development, I'll not be able to get this high density. And within a year, after developers, maybe like you, and real estate dealers had tried to organize land assemblies that had never happened. Within a year, they'd assembled all but about 3 pieces of property. And within 2 years later, they had 270 single-family houses at very high density in urbanist counties, where there had been 13 before. So I think this it's called graduated density zoning. The larger your parcel, the higher the density that's allowed, so that people will begin to cooperate. Should we cooperate? And it means that the landowners will get a good deal for selling the land. They know they're selling for a higher density development. So the people bidding for the land will have to offer them a price which is appropriate for land that will be rezoned as soon as the assembly happens. So it's been spreading, and not as fast as I had hoped. But I think for in older areas where the city wants land assembly, and for more housing, and certainly for more tax revenue, I think this graduated density zoning, as it's called, is a good idea. So that's one of the ways that really not parking oriented, but also it's easier to provide the required parking on a big piece of land. Say that many older buildings, like the one you're in,
yes, yeah,
couldn't have been developed with a parking requirement because you can't get the parking and the building onto the same small site.
Yes, you can't.
So I think that this land assembly is where the city wants it, and where the neighbors agree to it, and they realize that, well, this is what is the term? Underimproved. Is that a term that's used in real estate? When there's just a shack on valuable land, but that shack is somebody's home, and if they have to move, they'll have to get something else. If they can sell their underimproved land to make way for a higher density. And if the city requires some affordable housing because they're giving away an increase in density, they could require affordable housing in some of the units. So I think that there are some good ideas out there that.
Yes, definitely. So I especially like the no parking required idea, and I hope it takes hold really soon. And I thank you very much for chatting with me.
Okay, it was fun talking to you, and I'm happy to be reminded of my happy visit to Carnegie Mellon.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Bye. That was Donald Shoup. He has a simple fix for the chaotic and varied parking requirements in US cities. Remove the many, many pages of complicated parking regulations and replace them with one short sentence instead: no parking required. In the end, developers know best how much parking, if any, is needed. Parking, as Dr. Shoup points out, is an expensive use of our land. New York City, for example, has 3 million on-street parking spaces, and 95% of them are free. If people paid for parking, those funds could be put towards making streets and sidewalks more attractive with more amenities for everyone. That sounds like a great plan to me. You can find out more about impact real estate investing and access the show notes for today's episode at my website, evepicker.com. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to find out more about how to make money in real estate while building better cities. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today, and thank you, Donald, for sharing your thoughts. We'll talk again soon, but for now, this is Eve Picker signing off to go make some change.